So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alma Guerrero. I am a pediatrician, health services researcher, and recently appointed co-lead for our School of Medicine's Health Equity and Translational Social Sciences. Here to welcome all of you to today's seminar and to introduce our guest speaker. I have the pleasure today of introducing you to Dr. Diana Cuff. She is a professor, author, and practitioner in architecture and urban design. She has a bachelor's in psychology and design and a PhD in architecture. Her career has focused on affordable housing, the politics of space, and around issues of spatial justice. She founded City Lab in 2006, which is essentially a research and design center based here at UCLA. And it's through this center that she's really led efforts in centering the possibilities of city spaces with a spatial justice lens. She's widely published and the recipient of numerous recognitions and awards. I can't go through all of them, but I do want to highlight a few, just to give you a sense of her accomplishments and the impact that she's had on others. So the first is in 2019, she was awarded Women in Architecture Activist of the Year. This award is given to design architectures who have excelled in 5 areas: in design, being a new generation leader, an innovator, activist, and educator. One of the reasons that, and among many, by the way, that I believe she received this award, if you may not know it, she has been a strong advocate of affordable housing and co-authored legislation passed by California State Assembly in 2016 to allow second units on lots with single-family homes in order to address severe housing shortages. The other major sort of recognition and award has been given to Dr. Cuff from UCLA. She will be joining an elite group of faculty who are recognized as Faculty Research Lecturer of the Year. This was recently awarded to Dr. Cuff, and this is a recognition that's been around for almost 100 years. It was established in 1925. And through this recognition, it recognizes 2 academic senate members with records of exceptional achievement in research and or creative activities. So she's joining a very select group of UCLA scholars who have been accorded this honor and is the 135th lecturer, right, to sort of go down in history for us here at UCLA. So again, this is, I think, really highlights the importance of her accomplishments and her work. And it is with great enthusiasm that I get to introduce Dr. Cuff today. And thank you again for joining us.
And Mark is going to make sure that this. Okay, nice. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for having me. Thank you for that nice introduction, Dr. Guerrero. You know, when doctors come up to the architecture building, usually it's not very long before one of them says something to me like, I'm trying to remodel my garage. And you know, I'm very sympathetic to that, but I was thinking maybe you could help me get my specialist appointment before 2025. That's sort of my equivalent of the garage remodel. I actually say that in part because it will be interesting to me to see where our overlap is. I mean, Dr. Guerrero and I both have this justice and equity lens to the work, and maybe everyone here has that also. But what I'm going to talk about today is the questions of housing, which are obviously health related. We know people on the street have shorter lifespans and much more and more complicated medical issues. But I'm only beginning to understand that in part through my work with Dr. Wendy Slusser. We've just recently completed or are completing a study of well-being for people who are living unsheltered. And you know, in the process of doing that, we realized no one really knows what it means to have well-being when you're living unsheltered. So it kind of keeps taking me back to square one. So what I'm going to show you today is less about the research we've done or are doing on homelessness and more on housing more particularly, which obviously is directly tied. So, anyone who's walked on the streets of Los Angeles today sees this growing concern that we have for our unhoused neighbors. California has the highest number of unhoused residents in the entire US. Los Angeles County is really the center of our California concern. And it's mostly surprising, I think, to people that we're housing people pretty quickly, especially with Mayor Bass working on her executive directives, some of which have problems, which we can talk about later. But even as we find housing for people who are unhoused, more people come back onto the street every year. So the population continues to grow. And obviously, one of the key problems of this is that we're not building enough housing. And that's the kind of thing, as architects, we think about a lot. Just to bring us down a little bit before we look at the sort of optimistic ways of solving this, I think, sometimes the state of the state and the state of housing feels like a continuous crisis, and so we become slightly immune to it. But in fact, this crisis has never been worse since the Great Depression. And I think at the time of the Great Depression, we didn't have some of the concomitant problems that we have now, particularly around housing production. So how is it possible when you're having dinner with your family members and you're talking about affordable housing to even talk about it when the average house price in Los Angeles is $1 million or virtually? And that means that when we're building affordable housing, the average cost to construct it is something like $800,000. I mean, there's no way that will ever be affordable without subsidy. Sometimes we architects imagine we can invent technological solutions, 3D printed housing, things like that. Those are really interesting and important experiments, but nothing is going to really bridge the gap between what it costs to build a house here and the desperate need we have for more housing. So, this chart I think is really interesting to me because California is the worst of all 50 states in terms of housing cost relative to income. So you've probably heard the term of rent burdened, and there's a standard, again, there's a standard measure of housing, what housing should cost in each of your income categories. And the notion is that it should be 30%. Now that figure was developed historically at a time when we didn't have nearly the same income inequities that we have today. So it's fine to say for me that my rent should be 30% if I earn $100,000 a year. But for this person who's earning $40,000 a year, the other 70% of their income is not enough to cover the other costs of living. So that figure is actually pretty out of date, the 30% notion. And in fact, we have a new measure that we use called extremely rent burdened, which is that 50% of your income goes to your rent. That's much more common, and I'll show you some statistics about the University of California in relationship to that. But just to sort of complete this circle about housing and income and homelessness, it's also true that we're building less in California than we ever have in the past, though this past year has gotten somewhat better. And in California, we have more land zoned for single family houses than, all the land for multifamily housing combined. In a place like San Jose, 94% of the land there is zoned single family. And we now know that because of redlining and basic discrimination, especially against Black and Brown potential owners, that our single family zone is an inscription of historical racism baked into property. So somehow this 94% of the land in San Jose, 75% of the land in California has to be part of the solution. That's producing, given the cost of housing and the lack of housing availability, statewide gentrification with the displacement of lower income households across the state. And here's the graph that shows you, this comes from our partners up at UC Berkeley in the Turner Center, how much land is zoned for single family versus multifamily or even non-residential. In other words, that's zoning for offices and warehouses and manufacturing and everything else. Single family housing is the lion's share of our land resource, which is where we have to look to find places for people to live. And when you ask planners what the constraints to building is, a logical question like, why is it we're not building more? They say, first is land supply, and just what we were talking about. Then it's how that land is configured, meaning, home builders really love big lots. They don't want little bits of lots. And that's one of the things City Lab has been trying to address. Who owns it? And public opposition. And that's the NIMBY, not in my backyard phenomenon that we all know. We have it right here around UCLA, which has really been a problem of trying to build affordable housing for our own students. So, and of course, cost of construction, as I mentioned, is another fundamental barrier to building more housing. So I think if we first thought we would just build our way out of this crisis, given the evictions that happened, especially around the pandemic and the eviction protections that were put in place during that time, we've realized that protection and preservation are equally important. Usually in terms of housing, for housing affordability, there's 3 Ps that people talk about, but I think I'm adding some Ps to this. It's production, protection, and preservation that are the commonly assumed guidelines. But really, we also need to develop deep partnerships. When you look at the cities that have successfully dealt with their housing crisis and homelessness in particular, places like Denver has done a pretty good job. Tulsa has done a pretty good job. Of course, they have homelessness that's 1/10 or 1/20 of what we have. I mean, I feel like if we had 3,000 people living on the streets, we could deal. And that's what, say, Phoenix has. But nonetheless, those cities that are being successful are forming partnerships across all of their different agencies to make sure that there's a coherent approach to getting people housed. We also cannot do this without some forms of public assistance. Los Angeles has found some new and creative ways to do that. And then we also have to have political action on the part of communities that stand up for what their needs are. That constituency of people who've been locked out of housing has tended to be marginalized and to be silenced. And we're only as successful as we help uplift their voices. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about terminology. Housing insecurity, I think maybe everyone's familiar with that. It's a pretty big umbrella term. It doesn't, some measurement instruments are more specific about housing insecurity, but the colloquial way we use it is that it's the precarious experience of housing problems, including a lack of affordability, eviction, safety in your housing, substandard conditions, instability, meaning you might have to be moving often, overcrowding, and loss of housing. And really the strike last year by our own students was a lot about housing. And that's because we weren't paying, maybe some of you were the graduate students, we weren't paying enough, and maybe you'd say we still are not, for you to be able to study and have a roof over your heads. So I learned about this having spent a lot of time trying to understand how UCLA was meeting its housing needs and now has a housing guarantee for all the undergraduates. That's the term. But of course, that only works for the students who can afford what's available in housing at UCLA. And the way some students are managing that affordability, much to my surprise, as well as to the housing department and, housing and hospitality services on campus, 3 students to every room. Are any of you dorm residents? No, long past that. Medical residents also have housing issues. 3 students to every room often, or at least occasionally, they rent the floor to another student who then helps them. Yeah, that's right. That was the way my eyebrows went too at the beginning. But students are very creative in finding ways to figure out how to live and study. And it's pretty heroic and not something we should be asking those students who are most vulnerable and marginalized by our state institutions to do while they get their PhDs, master's degrees, and BAs. So that notion of justice is really right here in our own backyard. And you can see this is getting worse. I think the data that I just was reading as I was preparing for this talk is that 53% of California college students are considered housing insecure. That's more than half, obviously, and that's up from 36%, 1/3 of the students just 4 years ago. So that to me is a bright red light that we need to be paying more attention to and figuring out how to intervene in that circumstance. Oops. So the only other term I'll define now, I'm going to save the term community for later, is the question of social justice, spatial justice, which is a form of social justice that has geography. And that idea that justice has a geography really came from a distinguished professor in the planning department here at UCLA named Edward Soja, who wrote a book called Seeking Spatial Justice. And my own work is really indebted to his way of thinking. And he goes on to say that the equitable distribution and access to housing, services, amenities, and a livable planet are basic human rights. Design and planning can counteract spatial injustices. I'd like to just point out, we're not solving that, but we can contribute. And in some ways, I think one of the ways in which the formulation of the housing crisis as a crisis operates is to neutralize all of us from thinking that we have a role to play. So in my field, in architecture, it's typical that an architect will say, well, yeah, I can see that there's a health problem on the streets, but that's the doctors who have to deal with that. And having worked with Dr. Coley at the Venice Family Clinic, he says to me when I walk in, I'm not even talking to you until you build me 1 unit of housing. So he's like, that's your problem. So that's like, okay, I'm with you on this. But everyone tends to do this. And in fact, I really adhere to the practices and thinking of Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who's a Princeton professor of sociology and African American studies, who wrote a book called Viral Justice, which is in keeping with a setting here. She, during the pandemic, observed that a tiny virus had huge impacts, and that maybe we could think of social activism in the same way, that small acts of justice have the potential to spread. And that is the kind of operating principle that we use in my lab, and that we use to fight off the neutralizing effects that narratives of crisis and insolubility of those problems, like homelessness, tend to produce. So that's City Lab. We're in Perloff Hall, just on the other side of campus, a place you probably don't go any more often than I get down here. But you're always welcome. The door is always opening and open. And I just want to start, because I'm in a context of non-architects, to say this is the way we think of architecture as a kind of artistic practice. Here's this glorious building in Sydney, Australia, the Sydney Opera Hall. And I never want to get in the way of the production of this kind of work. I mean, it brings joy and pleasure and beauty into the world. So there are many ways in which architecture should and can be practiced as an art form. There's also a long tradition in architecture of futurist thinking. And these are usually conceptual projects that look something like this. This is Archigram practiced in the 60s, and we're reimagining that all cities could be built out of mega structures with infrastructure provided somehow, we don't really know how, and you'd have plug-in capsules where we would live. And when your capsule got tired or your family got bigger, you just pull your capsule out. There were really great thinking that doesn't get implemented, but maybe moves our thought processes forward. I don't want to get in the way of that either. And then there's a long history of data-driven design. Usually this is more industrial design, and the Scandinavians are geniuses at this. They did this to housing units as well as to chairs, but where literally specific forms of measurement go into the making and tailoring, almost like a glove to a hand, of the designed object and the use or function to which it's being put. So I'd like to propose, let's see, I'm sorry, my button's a little touchy. I want to propose not as artistic practice, not as futurism, and not as data-driven, say, ergonomics, but something that I'll call projective research. And this is a part of the way we work at CityLab that is not familiar even to the people in my own field. And I think it goes against our standard notions of experimentation and research in a way that has taken me a long time to build a convincing model that can do things like win the research professorship award. Otherwise, I was like proud, but kind of written off as an activist. Because the kind of work that's projective is always looking to advance a particular future outcome. It's not like it's a neutral entity. There's no reason to be neutral about something like the need for housing. The question is, how do we do that economically, beautifully, environmentally sound, and now? So this idea of projective research is not a concept that's well developed, but you can see it here in just this particular example. So here was a map. CityLab started in 2006, and this was one of the very first projects that was taken on by a group of our colleagues and students to map the surface parking lots in LA. It's the kind of thing we all think about all the time. You drive past the Gelsons again, or Northgate Market, or wherever, and there's a sea of parking, and you think, couldn't something be built over that at least? And so we started thinking about housing that would fit a parking space as a module, like a 10 by 20 foot housing module that you could put on columns, legs, and still keep the parking underneath. So that's a form of projective research. Then I think, okay, how would I in fact make that possible? What would Gelson's think if I put that in front of their building? How do I get their sign up? What are the resistance points? What would make that livable? And how much more housing would we get from it? So again, just to define this, projective research really is the use of conventional as well as innovative research methods for studies that are expected to lead to desired future outcomes. And maybe you've seen these kind of story polls around, which is laying out what the outlines of a building are going to be before it's there. And the neighbors then say, yeah, it's not so bad, or wow, I'm heading to the city council meeting to, voice my opinion about that. But it's a way of projectively allowing engagement with a future that isn't here yet. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different kinds of projective research pretty quickly. I'm supposed to be done in about 15 minutes. Okay, that's 5 minutes per. That's gonna be tricky. So you've seen some of these and the slides. So again, the other thing I think I'd like to just say is that slide use varies by discipline. Though I show a lot of slides, these are all informative. They're not illustrations per se. They're actually, a narrative is baked in. So it's not eye candy. It's really the subject matter. So Bruin Hub is at the Wooden Center, and there's one that's like going to be open maybe tomorrow in Strathmore. Backyard Homes was our first policy effort, and education workforce housing is one that we're working on now at CityLab. So Bruin Hub, this is paying attention with all the data that was collected that you see on the left, and I want to argue that this is all evidence-based research that has a design implication. So is this moving? Yeah. 43% of students commute a long ways to and from campus. You know, we see, this is like the stereotype image of Los Angeles, except the traffic's moving a little better than usual. And we were finding that students were sleeping in their cars and wanted to sleep in their cars, and the university was very reluctant to do that because no one wants to encourage people living in their cars, for sure. So what were we going to do about housing insecure students that couldn't get back to their homes? And we spent 3 years, 4 years working with that student group of commuters. We first tried to just deal with unhoused students and realized that there was an easy overlap with long distance commuting students between students who were housing insecure and unhoused, and that in a way you could destigmatize something like shelter beds if you talked about it more as a commuter hub. And destigmatization was a critical part of this. So we built these like giant jelly beans, which I think is really what made Wendy Slusser come to me, is she loved them, and everybody loves them. They're really like delicious, kind of, and also playful and fun, and they give a kind of dignity to people who need a place to stay overnight on campus without saying you're a distinct and separate group. So we built 5 of those with some funding that we pulled together. We built another 5. And all of this came out of these kinds of data gathering efforts with long distance commuting students. You know, one of these students commuted 4 hours each way to do his PhD in Chicano studies. Yeah, wow. I mean, think how easy it is for those of us who can live nearby, where you get the extra 3 hours of sleep you might want rather than doing what he was doing. So when you meet those students, you really feel like putting your shoulder into trying to help make something work better for them, especially given that they were leaving at, say, 11 at night to get back home because traffic was so bad earlier that, so then they were tired. You know, it was just a compounding of circumstances. So we decided that they needed a place to rest, nap, bring their own food, cook, find each other, network into commuter, and also so that the university could locate students who were experiencing homelessness because they really don't know who's unhoused and who's not. So this is if you go to Wooden Center, one of the squash courts is now the Bruin Hub. It's very cool. You can rent a pod, as we call them. They didn't think giant jelly bean was the right name. But you can rent a pod for 2 hours. And when the fire marshal's in a good mood, you can also stay overnight. It's a little random at the moment, and we're trying to overcome that. But during finals and midterms, it's available for overnight stays. And really, it should be available throughout. One of the questions about innovative design, and I suspect this is also true in innovative medicine, is how you fit into the existing regulatory context when there's no established category for it. So is this furniture? Is this a small apartment? Does it, you know, in some places people thought it would need a fire sprinkler inside. It's like, we're not going to fire sprinkler a couch. Like, let's talk about this as a couch. Again, we now have our second one set up. It's been extremely popular, and we have 5 more of these pods. 4 of them will be in the Strathmore Center. And what's really great about the second installation, which is in fact happening right now, the electrical systems are all getting built and all that cabinetry has been fabricated, is that it's tied to a basic needs center. So students who need food vouchers, students who need help with transit, with you know, apartment rentals in the long term, have a basic needs network that's there for them. And this is, I like to show this because literally that's a kind of napping room that other universities provide, not us. That happened to be at the University of Michigan. And no one goes there because it's so stigmatized and horrid. So it's clear that we need to bring the beauty and dignity of design to a full spectrum of students, just like health. Backyard Homes was the longest running projective research City Lab ever did. If it took me this long to do stuff, I I would die before my next research project got done. This was probably a 12-year project of trying to understand how neighborhoods already in Los Angeles were solving their housing crisis through granny flats, basically. Everybody, like in some neighborhoods, 2/3 of the lots already have a granny flat, or what we call a backyard home. So we spent a long time studying that, studying lot types, talking to neighbors, trying to figure out what kinds of building technologies you could slip down a side yard and pop out in a backyard. We studied this from every possible angle with the thought that we would get the city council here in Los Angeles to pass an ordinance to allow what was already happening. But you know, if you've spent any time in Los Angeles, you also know that the city council is a highly politicized group. And in fact, one, kind of loud neighbor can shut down a council member's support. So we could never get the 8 votes we wanted. When I was approached by my local assemblyman who said, what can we do at the state level to help with housing production? I said, oh, I've got something for you. And I pulled together a team of experts and we wrote the secondary unit law that passed in 2016 and has now produced, I think, 60,000 units of housing. And maybe you'd say, 68,000 have been built in California alone. It's become a model legislation for other states. There are 30,000 permits for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in California alone just last year. And maybe more glorious than that, which I didn't really realize when I wrote this legislation, this is the first piece of state-like law I got involved with, is that it's constantly evolving. Now I say, duh, but what we first had as to get 2 units on a lot, one the existing house and a rental unit, has now fluoresced into multiple units, and SB 9 was a more recent one that allow a lot split so that ownership of land is more equitable. That's a long conversation, but that you could build 2 units on each one. So now it's 4 units per lot. So each one of these kind of iterations is a way of improving upon legislation that sort of took the finger out of the dike in housing production on single family zones. I really like these programs that the city has now to subsidize or enhance ways to provide housing for particular groups. Veterans returning home is another one, senior citizens is another one. And our passage of ULA is going to subsidize, ULA is the big United to House Los Angeles mansion tax is what it's typically called. And the courts just decided that that was legal. And we expect to get something like $700 million per year to subsidize housing. Now we're closing that gap between an $800,000 construction cost and what people can afford to pay for rent. So I think these kind of creative finance means and legislative means are really interesting. The last one I'll talk about is education workforce housing. So when we finished the secondary units, I realized I had no way of controlling for affordability, and given the level of the housing shortage, it meant that every secondary unit, no matter how small, was renting for more per square foot. At least that's what it seemed to me than I was expecting. We have all along had an equation between size of the unit and rent. And though that varies together, it still isn't bringing it in low enough to make it so that it's actually affordable. Research has since shown that, in fact, the secondary units are renting for less per square foot than original houses. So it is slightly affordable. But I started looking for land, underutilized land, just like backyards, that was publicly owned. And I just did a transect like a biologist would do through a, I don't know, piece of ocean or a piece of a meadow. And I took that across Los Angeles and realized that this 17-mile arc that we drew, so that we weren't missing kind of parts of LA that we didn't live in,
one of the problems of being here at UCLA is that you tend to see what's in front of you, not the fuller range of the Los Angeles landscape. There were schools within a mile radius of every mile marker that was on that 17-mile transect across the LA basin. And like, okay, that's a lot of land. Historically, it was the Jeffersonian survey that gave certain sections, 6 and 36 of a township to schools. I never knew that. That's really interesting. And schools have historically sold off that patrimony to do different kinds of subsidy, but they still are really widely distributed, like big pieces of confetti across the entire state. So every county, when we started doing GIS-based research, had school land that was underutilized. Turns out in California, there's 150,000 acres of school. That's equivalent of about 10 Manhattans, and half of that is underutilized. Not a playing field, not a teacher parking lot, not a building, but stuff that could be something else, like a warehouse or a dirt field that used to be the 8th baseball diamond for the high school, but now they all do Kapawara or something else. So we started trying to figure out how we might work with public schools to build this. Okay, oops. Turned out there were 5 of the 1,024 school districts in California. 2 had built something when we started this work 3 years ago. One of those was LAUSD, which is the 2nd largest school district in the country after New York. So they have their own real estate division. So they had the capacity to do this kind of work. And this is what they had built in Los Angeles. The only other one was Casa del Maestro, which is up in the Bay Area, a place where when you look into it, in both Los Angeles and in the Bay Area, they lose something like 40% of their teachers each year because of housing costs. And overall in the state, 25% of the school districts lose teachers based on housing costs. So we can't raise incomes for schools without going through a whole other legislative process. But based on what I knew from the secondary units, I knew we could rezone school land so that it could all have housing. So after studying that for a long time, it took 8 years typically for these to get built. That's 3 different school boards. These are things I didn't know. Every school board lasts 3 years. So a bunch of people get onto the school board out of their good natures and talk about housing, but before they're finished with the conversation, they're out and the new group is in. And then they start talking about it. Everybody's concerned, but there's no continuity. So how could we possibly shorten this timeline so that it could happen effectively? We're now working with California School Board Association throughout the whole state, looking at these models and training people to use the second piece of legislation that I authored with some colleagues, particularly Jane Blumenfeld, who used to be in the planning department here in Los Angeles, to rezone all school land so that it would not need that part of the process, so that everyone could build up to 3 stories without any prior approval. So neighbors couldn't stop the development of a fairly low apartment kind of organization, and that it would guarantee affordability first for teachers and staff and next for city employees. So that comes into law January 1. And I now have 80 school districts who've signed up to be trained how to use that. And we're running these kind of academies that help school districts build, do conceptual design. How many units could they get on the land that they have? So you see that on the right, and with a whole bunch of handbooks about how to do it on the left. So I'm just going to close by saying that solutions to our housing crisis, as well as its health implications, will have to be shaped in partnerships with community. This is the nothing about us without us rule, including local organizations and activists, faith-based groups who now have their own legislation to build housing on their land, government agencies, non-governmental organizations, and public institutions like UCLA. That's why we're happy to be part of the Be Well Seminole Healthy Campus group. Be Well is built environment. So with my colleague Yang Yang, she and I are running this part of Wendy Slusser's giant model, really, that UCLA could be a leader in developing a community health model out of a university campus. And you should be seeing what we're going to be working on soon. These are just some of our priorities. This is not a housing solution, but that area here, which is right in front of the Med 100, 200 buildings on at the plaza, is a giant empty piece of sidewalk, and we're going to turn it into a parklet that makes a place to rest and people to hang out, maybe one of the fruit vendors to come, so that there's a new gathering place, and to kind of build a human bridge along that area where the hospital really divides the campus from the rest of the city. And it's all involved with students and staff, people who can bring energy and ideas as well as resources, and you're all welcome to join. That's the group that's really heading the pod leadership. And this is my lab, folks, and nothing I do happens without all of them. And I just want to thank them for their work, and thank you for coming today. So maybe we have a time for a few questions.
Yes, I think
Great.
we do. Thank you so much. Can I come work at your city? Right,
Yes,
thank you so
yes.
much, and congratulations on this new piece of legislation that is about to take
Thank you.
effect. It looks like we have one question from the audience.
Does City Lab have the same data for staff or students as it does for? Does it have the same data for staff as it does for students as far as housing insecurity?
Mhm.
I did see that the AB do something or other. Is that just for K through 12, or would that be able to be used by universities as well?
Well, we don't have good data for staff. We started collecting it when we were working on the students. We have only barely adequate data on students. So data collection is critical. And I don't think that the higher ed groups that are collecting data on housing insecurity have been collecting it on staff. But what we know from K through 12 is that staff are in a harder position than teachers, than classified positions in terms of housing insecurity. So that's why we built them into the overall strategy for who this school lands housing that's affordable would go to. So it's only K through 12, but universities have something called sovereignty, which is kind of an amazing thing. And that is, you don't have to go through zoning. You don't have to go through, you can build whatever you like, unless your neighbors are so loud that they taint your reputation by complaints, which is what's happened to us here at UCLA and other campuses. But they could build whatever they needed to on the campus if they had the space. And staff housing or resident housing, the kind of housing we all need, I think has become more visible lately.
So we have a question coming in from the chat, and it reads, have you incorporated any health interventions into the design of these spaces? Great question.
Well, it depends on what you mean by health intervention. I mean, I think rest is a health intervention. So rest is one of the components of the Bruin Hub. And the commuter student group is a pretty full service group for the Bruin Hub that's in Woodin. Though no measures. We have measures through people's Bruin cards of who's using it, where they, how, as long as they opt in, how far they live from campus, things like that. But we don't have any health measurements there. But I think that the new Strathmore Bruin Hub, because of its ties to the basic needs programs, which is a state funded, really came through during the pandemic. I think we could do better health outcomes studies there. I'd love to have someone working on that In case anybody in the audience wants to follow up.
Thank you, Dr. Cuff. Thank you, Dr. Guerrero, for the introduction. I have a question. You know, during the season finale of Patriot Act by Hassan Minhaj, he mentioned how we're like overwhelmed with like issues. Like there's hard to choose which issue to focus on because there's so many in the world. I know we have the LAHSA, LA Homeless Service Authority count for the homeless in January. I took part of it this year. But how are you getting people to care about these issues in a very apathetic world?
Oh, yeah. Again, for me, because those can be really overwhelming kinds of questions, I really think Ruha Benjamin is right. The viral justice model is the only one I can live with, which is in my center, which isn't very big. We do something every day to try to build the world we want to live in. And that might be small. Sometimes it's big. You know, sometimes we get to change state law. But usually that starts with something that's really tiny. And when we were starting to work on backyard homes, for example, all my colleagues said, you know, Dana, this isn't architecture. This is like, you know, home remodels with a DIY guy in a truck. And it's like, yeah, maybe, but you know, still it's housing, like might be worth looking into. And now they all have jobs. Like they all are doing backyard homes. And we've made 60,000 units. You know, I can say to Dr. Coley, I didn't bring you one. I was part of bringing 60. I certainly didn't do it by my own self by any means, but our little work in big picture things, it wasn't very big, made a real contribution. And if you make one lever, you know, operate, sometimes it, you know, has a effect of having lots of ripples. So that's my sort of motto for life.
There's another question from the chat, and it reads, I see that there are many apartments around LA. Will this move the needle a bit?
Yeah, meaning there's new apartments getting built.
Mhm.
Yeah, they're, you know, they're Proposition H and HHH, which we passed to tax ourselves, which is pretty amazing given, you know, people's general dislike of taxes. We taxed ourselves to build more affordable housing and to provide the services with them. And it was supposed to provide 10,000 units of housing. Sure, it was slow, but we're building all 10,000 and more. So the work that's happening and that you're seeing around, some of it is market rate. I don't know, you know, I'm particularly concerned about building affordable housing, but building market rate housing is building housing. So in the production P, it's still good. Most of us can't afford it, but you know, as that's going on, we see more construction. We feel Los Angeles changing, and our notions of what Los Angeles can be changes. And to me, that's really important. When I started working on the secondary units, I was protested saying that I was trying to Manhattanize Los Angeles. Now that's with a granny flat. So there was this idea that if we doubled the density of Los Angeles, we would be making something like New York City. And it's just because we don't know how to think about it. You know, we think of Los Angeles as a sprawling single family zone because it's 75% that. We haven't realized that in the backyards of a lot of those houses, there were already illegal units, and now there's a lot of legal ones. And the ones that were illegal are now getting legalized. So we were already living in whatever they were worried about. And you know, it made life more affordable for the homeowner as well as for the person renting in the back. So I'm happy to have the changes in Los Angeles giving us new pictures of where we live and what the beauties of that could be.
Thank you for this really interesting talk. I was wondering how you balance the need for more housing with the perhaps removal of green space and the environmental impacts of construction.
Yeah, so I mean, especially here in Los Angeles, we are park poor. So there's no green space that should ever be removed. I mean, if you're thinking about vacant lots, most of those are not green space per se. But none of the housing that we're talking about would consider taking, I don't know, I think that's a no-go line, especially in LA. I mean, maybe if you live someplace, this would be heretical for me to say, but maybe if you live somewhere near the beach where there's a ton of open space, maybe their green space or their public open space isn't quite as critical as it is in South LA or in East LA, where there are even fewer parks than in the rest of the city. But we need more parks, not fewer. I think we don't even take away that from schools, right? So one of the ways to answer your question would be if we would just open up the schoolyards to neighborhoods in the evenings and weekends. And, you know, that would probably be a couple of years' work, but that could happen too. And that would increase the green space in every neighborhood, really.
Any other questions before we wrap up? And if not,
Thank you
perhaps
for
we will
having me.
finish, yes, a
Yeah.
few minutes early. And thank you so much for being here with us. And I know personally I could stay on and listen for a lot longer. I just really admire and appreciate the work that you're doing. So thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much. Thank you for having me.